Long days and pleasant nights to all fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I am known in this realm as Jaime and Fuego, and if it please ya, join me here for some palaver on the first entry of the Road to the Dark Tower movie, a special presentation here courtesy of Infuegotainment and the Horror Show. And this is of significance because of the fact that it has been a decade since the Dark Tower film was originally announced, and we are finally seeing it come to the big screen. It has been an arduous journey, almost as much as the Gunslingers himself, Mr. Roland Deschain. What an epic series, and what a highly anticipated movie, especially for someone like me who is an enormous, ginormous fan of the man who I truly believe lives up to his name, Mr. Stephen King. As you can see by the collection beside me, I own and have now read nearly every single Stephen King book that has ever been written, short stories included as well. And the reason for this was because a number of years ago, over 7 at this point, I realized that a good deal of Stephen King's work actually interconnects. When I was growing up, I was a big fan of The Stand first and foremost, then I saw It, then I eventually saw Pet Sematary, and those were my top 3 as I was growing up. Salem's Lot a very close fourth, but it wasn't until I realized that so many of these books had characters that came back, like Father Callahan from Salem's Lot, like Flag from The Stand, and they all kind of intertwine with his magnum opus, that's right, The Dark Tower, the 2 books that you see there in the very center. And those books were actually originally inspired by an 1855 poem by Robert Browning entitled Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which he originally read when he was a sophomore at the University of Maine. And the funny thing is, originally he was writing this in 1970, like right after reading that poem, and yet it took nearly a decade to actually see the initial entry in it, which came courtesy of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction between 1978 and 1981. So I am here as we anxiously anticipate this movie, which had everything from J.J. Abrams originally attached to direct, to Ron Howard, to various studios from Universal, to Warner Brothers, to currently at Columbia, which is owned by Sony, that is finally releasing it, and so many different people scheduled to play Deschain. We had Javier Bardem, we had Viggo Mortensen, we also had Russell Crowe. There were all kinds of other names attached to play Eddie and various other characters, but all of those fell by the wayside. None of them came to fruition. But now, thanks to the hands and the vision of a much younger director, Nicolas Arcel, who had pretty much only done one significant movie leading up to this, we are finally seeing a big screen incarnation of, once again, that magnum opus that everyone loves so much. There were 7 entries to it, including an 8th kind of like in-between entry known as The Wind Through the Keyhole. There was also a side story called The Little Sisters of Euloria, if I remember correctly the title, if I'm not totally butchering the pronunciation. But so after I found out that all of this King stuff tied in with the Dark Tower, and that so many of his other characters reappear over time, I just realized, man, I have to go and start reading every single Stephen King book in its respective order. And so that's what I did. And even though I had already read the original Dark Tower revised edition, because that's right, Stephen King pulled a George Lucas, and when he was coming to his final 3 books after a life or death experience, and a life-changing experience at that, as opposed to continuing to space out the entries of the Dark Tower amongst all of his other amazing books, 8, 10, however many years in between, he decided, okay, nothing is guaranteed. Tomorrow is not certain. So I'm just going to take this time right around the turn of the century to write the final 3 entries all in succession. So what he did at that time was jump back and revise the original book. And so here in part 1 of our Road to the Dark Tower movie, we are going to be discussing that first book that was published in the 5 separate parts that I mentioned, The Gunslinger. So this book, original version and revised version. Now, the first time I actually read this book, I read the revised version, as I just mentioned, and I must admit, there's a lot of additional stuff. It's very cool, but unlike The Stand, where it just adds nothing but just enriching stuff, because King also added additional things to The Stand a number of years after its original publication. That was all stuff that I don't necessarily feel like affected the narrative in any way. It was purely supplemental. It was almost like getting the director's cut of a movie, right? Whereas King eventually, as the entries of the Dark Tower went on, he expanded upon the mythos of this universe. There was more terms implemented. There was more locations mentioned. Characters were actually developed and enriched more so. And as far as a first-time reader, and I'm not sure which you guys may be, if you've ever read The Gunslinger before, or if you're completely new to this and are just curious about stuff leading up to this film, which comes out July 28th. It was delayed a couple times, unfortunately, but I think for good reason, because they are trying to beef up the special effects, they want a better marketing campaign, and they have two big-time stars in Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, respectively playing Roland and the Man in Black, aka Walter O'Dim, aka the Walking Dude, aka Randall Flagg, aka Martin, the Enchanter, or the Wizard of, Roland's father's court. And so this series essentially melds together sci-fi, horror, fantasy, spaghetti westerns. There is just so many different things that you wouldn't necessarily think would all mash together, but King does such a wonderful job of making it all his own. And so, yeah, it's really, if you have never read this before, I recommend checking out the original version of the Dark Tower, the unrevised version. Now, that version shows that this place called Midworld, where Roland dwells, is very similar to our own world, and it makes you really think that when they talk about how the world moved on and stuff like that, we're looking back at our own world, and there's lots of references to things that you would have seen in our own. And so as time went by, King actually developed this aspect of multiple dimensions all intertwining, and eventually he decided that Midworld, Roland's land of sorts, was not necessarily supposed to be our world, but a similarly mirrored alternate, reality dimension, whatever the hell you want to call it. And so that's the thing. I recommend, if you've never read the series before, start with the untampered version of The Gunslinger. But if you have indeed, it is so much more enriching, because I just finished rereading this book, and here on the 19th of January, that's right, at the 19th hour Pacific Standard is when I release this. And so we're going to be going book by book for the next 7 months on the 19th at the 19th hour to, just retread through and see how much, because this new film is supposed to be an amalgamation. It's not necessarily supposed to be a direct adaptation. Like those Marvel comics were almost, their own thing in the fact that they were prequels that expanded upon the story. This film, the Arcel film, is supposed to be a sequel that expands upon the story. And for new readers, I really don't want to give away too much with regards to that, but I think going back through all 7 of the books and also taking some time to discuss The Wind Through the Keyhole and Little Sisters of Eluria will be, it will be proper, it will be good context as we approach this film and as we approach the Dark Tower movie. So now, after I've given all of that back information, which is probably far too much, let's talk about The Gunslinger and whether the changed and revised and tampered version, as some may think it, or the original. Let's just discuss the story. So you have Roland Deschain, that's right, the Gunslinger, the man who was very similar to the Man with No Name from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More, that spaghetti western trilogy that the Italians did that was so fantastic. That was the inspiration that King took for devising this gunslinger who was after this evil sorcerer who has basically contributed to the destruction of his land and is also, as he presumes, trying to destroy all of reality through the Dark Tower. The Dark Tower, to explain it in layman's terms, is essentially the nexus of not just our universe, but every universe. Like, imagine all of these different alternate dimensions, nearly an infinite amount, but they all have overlapping aspects, and they all kind of tie in with this key source, which is the tower. And this man that Roland is pursuing, our, valiant gunslinger, our cowboy, if you will, he is, this man in black is trying to get to that tower before Roland. Roland wants to save the whole fabric of all of reality, and this man in black wants to just create immense chaos and destroy everything. Now granted, if you've read these books before, you know that the narrative expands and becomes something much, much larger than that. But at least in this very first book, that's what we know. And he is pursuing this man through the Mohaine Desert, and he comes across a gentleman by the name of Brown, a corn farmer, who's just out in the desert. He's got a little crow homie, and that's pretty much his only companion. And he shows some civility. He shows God, friendship and kindness to the gunslinger as he is running low on water. His mule is dying, and he proceeds to obviously have some things heavy on his heart. And one thing we have to mention about Roland, very similar to Stephen King himself, is that the guy loves telling stories. So he has this burden upon his conscience, and he proceeds to tell Brown about just this battle that he had at the small city of Tull before he goes, massacres a whole town. He's hot on the trail of the man in black. He gets to this town. He's trying to fuel up. He beds a woman to get some information, of which he succeeds. But the prints of the man in black are all over the place, including a weed eater guy who was like addicted to this like demon grass type stuff that you presume is a narcotic or like a heroin type thing, and this dude has raised him from the dead, so we're talking immediately. I know this is the horror show and a lot of people may be thinking, hey, what's scary about the Dark Tower? Well, we're talking a dude gets raised from the dead and is acting super creepy and strange and not quite himself by the time Roland gets to this small little town. It ends in a confrontation between him and this big heavy set religious, almost like a fanatical Jim Jones type lady who had apparently got to bang downtown with the man in black before he went on. And so everything ends terribly. I don't necessarily want to go into full-on spoiler territory here, but let's just say that Roland pretty much decimates the entire town and also makes a big choice that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So after he, kind of gives all of this information to Brown, the guy is kind enough to have fed him, given him a place to sleep that night. His mule dies, he moves on through the desert, and that's where he encounters Jake Chambers, which is actually one of the biggest and most important characters in this series, and he shows up at various times. And this all happens at a way station, which has kind of like an inn with a little cellar area and like a stable for your horses. And so this was almost like a stop-off point of sorts, and this is where he's not expecting to find a kid that has been torn from another reality that sounds very much like New York City, but this is where meets this kid, forges a friendship, and he starts to kind of learn a little bit about himself in the process as well. There is also a dead, like, demon-type guy in the cellar when Roland goes to explore, and so he is hot on the trail of this evil wizard, and the guy is almost like laying traps at every stop that he gets to. He's almost like laying stuff to make him slow down, people for him to care about, because despite the fact that he does act so cold-blooded all the time, he does have a conscience. And so the third part is called The Oracle and the Mountain. So after we hear about Tull and, the initial introduction to the gunslinger and that little bit about the way station, eventually they get past the desert, and as they are just about to enter this mountainous area where they're pursuing the man in black, that's where they meet this crazy succubus oracle, and Jake is going out wandering around, acting crazy, and basically sleep trance, walking towards this area where there's like black rock surrounding. It's very similar to what we see decades later in a short story that King wrote called N, which is one of my absolute favorites. There are these creepy black rocks surrounding almost like a center altar of sorts, and once again, Roland is totally fine with going down on the bang down to get some information about what the next step is, where the tower is, what this journey is going to entail, because he wants some hints, he wants some information. And after that happens, they go up into the mountains, and that is where we reach the fourth entry, which was published. All of these were spaced out by like months to a year. So as I mentioned, it's nice for us to be able to read this all in one entry, one volume, because originally people were seeing this in a small magazine that I mentioned between 1978 and 1981. So it wasn't until 81 where he really just got the gears going, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna do 3, I'm gonna do 4, which is the one that we're at right now, the Slow Mutants, which are basically almost like mutated from from a nuclear fallout type thing. Cave dwellers, very similar to The Descent, and I know Stephen King loved The Descent, so surprise, surprise. But yeah, they're just disgustipated, nasty, almost like think of The Hills Have Eyes, those type of guys. And yeah, so that's what him and Jake encounter as they go into this cave pursuing the man in black, and they jump on this little mini railroad. It's almost like Indiana Jones style, and they get in this little car, and they're just going through, and there's more and more hints about, the world that was left behind, I guess. And eventually it comes to a point where Roland has to decide if he's going to go after the man in black, or if he is going to actually, save Jake and keep him as part of his journey, and as somebody who's going to help him find this tower. It's one of the most intriguing, just kind of perplexing problems which is, put forth in this book, but it's so well written. I know King expanded some of the, language when he was redoing the book. He said that it felt too much like a writer trying to write as opposed to naturally flowing, and I guess that's where the craft is, sharpened and so on as the years go by. But yeah, it's just really interesting reading both, because once again, I think new time reader, check out the original text. If you are somebody who has already read and is jumping back, I personally recommend read this first, read the other 6 entries, and then after you finish the 7th book, jump right back into this one, because of the fact that there's foreshadowing. There's almost too much of it. There's stuff that they didn't reveal in this book that they reveal halfway through this one is going to happen, which kind of turned me off a little bit. It's like, okay, King, spell it out, but he has this almost propensity to do it in some of his later works where he's like, oh, so-and-so, enjoys this when it's going to be his last, and it's just, I don't know. He doesn't need to make it as obvious as he does, but they are so similar that really at the end of the day, depending on which one you can more easily track down, they are both awesome, they are both compelling, they both meld together. As I mentioned, westerns, horror, fantasy. It's such a cool smattering, and the one biggest thing that we have to mention is the fact that it also flashes back not just to this point in his journey, but also to the very beginning of it. And that's actually what Marvel Comics adapted for, these volumes that you see right here. Some of that came from this book, where it flashes back to, when him and, one of his buddies, Cuthbert, actually see somebody, committing treachery. And then there's another part where he actually has to, become a man and challenge his teacher to become a real gunslinger. So there's some really compelling stuff where it gives backstory about Roland and, the land that he came from, Gilead and New Canaan. And it's just very, very compelling and very rich and very deep, which is why the series went on to have all of those additional entries, which is why Marvel Comics went to extreme lengths to adapt stuff and fill in both backstory and even some of the gaps, in some of the later adventures as well. They are currently in the midst of adapting the 2nd book, The Drawing of the Three, and I think as of the 19th here of January, when this is going to be going up, I think that they are either at the final volume or the final volume is about to be collected and released. So very, very cool. Very exciting to talk about all of this. I adore this series. Awesomeness. On that note, do not forget to like, share, subscribe, follow me on all social media sectors, just at Jaime and Fuego, and make sure to seek out the Horror Show channel. If you haven't subscribed here on YouTube, please do that. We greatly appreciate it. Porfa y gracias. We usually put up 2 episodes a day, sometimes 3 in this case, as you're seeing today. And trailer reactions, how-tos, film reviews, convention coverage, comedy sketches, video game let's plays. We are relentless with our coverage for you guys, and I am going to be relentless with this coverage. I hope that even if you have read these before, maybe you'll reread these with me. So you have a month to do it. Drawing of the Three is about 400 pages or so, which is practically double what this original Gunslinger novel is, but hey, it is well worth it. So, until the 1900th hour Pacific Standard Time on the 19th of February, I once again extend a grande gracias. And on that note, I must implore all of you to not forget the faces of your fathers and your mothers. And until that Wheel of Ka brings us once more to the 19th day of next month, hasta luego, sin amigos. But let's make it sooner rather than later. And until then, stay scared.